Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. First, they came after the Confederate generals, then they came after George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and then they came after people nobody really remembers anymore, like K. Smith and Stephen Foster. And now the woke vanguard has turned its sights on Homer. No, not Homer Simpson, as nice as that would be. I mean Homer, the poet, the Iliad, Odyssey, Trojan Horse, that guy. Last June, while our eyes were glued onto Minneapolis and the chaos erupting there, and in every other metropolis in America practically, She Martin said on Twitter, quote, "Be like Odysseus and embrace the long haul to liberation, and then take the Odyssey out of your curriculum because it's trash." To which Heather Levin, a 9th grade English teacher at Lawrence High School in Lawrence, Massachusetts, responded, quote, "Ha ha ha, very proud to say we got the Odyssey removed from the curriculum this year." Oh, and in case you're wondering why I haven't actually shown their actual tweets here like I usually do, it's because both Martin and Levine have restricted their Twitter accounts, so we peons can't actually go questioning their wisdom. And I'm not kidding there, gang. When Megan Cox-Gurdon of the Wall Street Journal reached out to Levine and to Lawrence High School to confirm that the Odyssey had indeed been erased from the curriculum, the response that she got was that her question was quote-unquote invasive.
But that's only the tip of the iceberg.
Sarah Bond, a professor of history and the director of undergraduate studies at the University of Iowa, suggested in a tweet that all disciplines like the classics be quote-unquote dismantled and burned. In classrooms across the country, the bard, William Shakespeare himself, is being ripped from the curriculum and thrown onto the same garbage pile that they've thrown Homer in. And this insanity isn't just confined to the classroom, gang. Over at Brown University, students demanded the removal of 2 statues. No, not of Confederate generals. No, not of Union officers. No, not even of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. The 2 offending statues were Caesar Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. And the reason for these cancelizations, vaporizations, and erasures? White supremacy, of course, as well as a host of other 21st century sins, such as racism, sexism, ableism, and anti-Semitism. In fact, the campaign to erase the bard from pretty much every public school across America provides a tiny little microcosm as to the reasons why this entire campaign is going on. Per the New York Post, quote, "A slew of English literature teachers told the School Library Journal, SLJ, how they were ditching the likes of Hamlet, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet to instead make room for modern, diverse, and inclusive voices. Shakespeare was a tool used to civilize black and brown people in England's empire," insisted Shakespeare scholar Ayanna Thompson, a professor of English at Arizona State University. "Teachers also need to challenge the whiteness of the assumption that Shakespeare's works are universal," insisted Jeffrey Austin, who is head of a Michigan high school's English literature department. Former Washington State public school teacher Claire Brunk told SLJ she banished the bard from her classroom to stray from centering the narrative of white, cisgender, heterosexual men.
What the hell is that?
This is the manifestation of ideological madness that has gripped academia. And one of the prime instigators of this madness? Say hello to Professor Daniel Padilla Peralta, professor of classics, tenured at Princeton University, FYI, who, as just a little aside, wants to destroy the entire field of the classics. Why? Because, you see, the field isn't just brimming with the usual racism and white supremacy charges that are now a dime a dozen in pretty much every field of academia. No, according to Peralta, the classics, which, FYI, is the study of the literature, culture, and religion of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, was one of the primary creators of the quote-unquote concept of whiteness itself. And he has even gone further than that. At an academic conference in 2019, Peralta called the classics his own field of study, FYI, part vampire and part cannibal. Far from being extrinsic to the study of Greco-Roman antiquity, the production of whiteness turns on closer examination to reside in the very marrow of classics. He has gone even further and said that every field, not just the classics, have to be racialized. Quote, "White men will have to surrender the privilege they have of seeing their words printed and disseminated. They will have to take a back seat so that people of color and women and gender non-conforming scholars of color benefit from the privilege of seeing their words on the page." And if there is actually pushback against this, if people actually have the guts to stand up and raise their hand and point out the obvious, that this is making academic merit and scholarly research subservient to postmodern racial and sexualized politics, Peralta says then that the classics and other fields will have to literally be blown up for what he calls reparative intellectual justice. Of course, gang, this is all wrong! Ancient Greece and ancient Rome not only gave us philosophy, medicine, government, and the recorded beginnings of many of the fields of science that we still have up to today, but they also gave us the ideas of ordered liberty and of a universal moral law binding on all people in all places at all times. You know, two of the primary ideas that actually eventually erased slavery from this hemisphere of the world, while it still survived and thrived in the East for about another 100 years. No biggie. Men like Caesar Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, who apparently now have Brown University students in a tizzy, ruled over a genuinely diverse Roman Empire, which incorporated multiple people, tribes, cultures, and religions, and which allowed these diverse people, tribes, cultures, and religions to live in peace under the Pax Romana. And not only that, but citizenship, with all the rights and privileges attached to it, was open to anyone who lived within the boundaries of the empire. In other words, if the Romans had conquered your tribe or your people, you didn't have to stay a conquered people. You could actually become a fully fledged Roman citizen. Something that was, FYI, entirely unheard of in the ancient world up to that time. Monty Python actually put it best in The Life of Brian.
All right, but apart from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system, and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Brought peace?
Oh, peace! Shut up!
In Shakespeare, not only have his plays and poems been translated into 100 different languages, not only have there been productions of Hamlet in 75 different languages since 1960. Not only have there been 7 professional Arabic productions of Shakespeare between 2005 and 2014, but the idea that his plays center on the white, straight, cisgendered male is, in his own words, a tale told by an idiot. Who's the main character in Twelfth Night? Viola. Who saves Antonio, the merchant of Venice? Portia. Othello? He's a Moor. Reed, a Muslim. Not only that, but characters like Richard III, Claudius, Polonius, Edmund the Bastard, Malvolio, all of them are Shakespearean villains. You know what else they are? All of them are straight, white, cisgendered men. This is the part where I know everyone expects me to go into a rant about how this is an attack on the classics, an attack on literature, an attack on education, an attack on children. And you're right, it's all of those things. But to drop a phrase that is becoming all too common around here, it's actually worse than that, because this erasure of the classics from Homer to Shakespeare is at its heart an attack on the imagination. Now, unfortunately, imagination has suffered a decline in fortunes. More often than not, we seem to equate it with daydreaming, make-believe. How many times have we, whether as parents, teachers, mentors, employers, or just employees, told children or co-workers to stop daydreaming, to pay attention to their work? How many times have we gotten after ourselves because we sat down to do a particular task and then found ourselves daydreaming while we were looking out the window? But this is a very shallow understanding of the imagination, because in actuality, the imagination is an intrinsic and vital power that human beings possess. Now, of course, the first obvious question is, what is it? And pretty much ever since there have been philosophers, there's been that question. For Plato, it was the lowest of the four intellectual powers: reason, understanding, faith, imagination, which allowed a person to create shadows and phantasms in his mind that reflected things that he saw in the real world, and which themselves were simply shadows and copies of the real things, the Platonic forms that existed in the realm of ideals, which, FYI, was an actual real place in Plato's philosophy and not merely a mental projection. The shadows and phantasms led men to their material counterparts, and the material counterparts then led to the actual real things themselves, to the Platonic forms. So in this way, the imagination was actually the first step towards wisdom, knowledge of the Platonic forms themselves. For our man Aristotle, the imagination was, quote, "that in virtue of which an image occurs in us," unquote. Notice the key phrase that Aristotle uses there, in us. Unlike perception, where our minds receive an image because our senses are actively receiving external stimuli, the imagination can create images in our mind when there is absolutely no external stimuli, one of the major differentiations between perception and the imagination. Thomas Aquinas followed Aristotle in this regard, describing the imagination as the ability to form and manipulate images that are already in our minds. According to Aquinas, through our five senses, we harvest images that we see all around us in the material, realistic world. And from there, once they are harvested and stored in our minds, our imagination can play with them. So, for example, the original idea of the unicorn came about because somebody, somewhere at some time, took the idea of the horse, took the idea of a single horn, put it together, and voila, as the French say. Closer to our own time, multiple people have slightly expanded this general idea of the imagination. Gregory Curry and Ian Ravencroft, for example, differentiated between different types or subtypes of imagination. There was, according to them, the creative imagination, which was the combining of ideas in unexpected, unconventional ways. There was the sensory imagination, which was perception-like experiences but without the needed stimuli. And there was what they called the recreative imagination, the ability to see the world from a point of view that was not your own. Another modern distinction has been between imagining from the outside versus imagining from the inside. Imagining from the outside that you are, for example, Napoleon, involves you creating a scenario in which you are Napoleon. Imagining from the inside that you are Napoleon involves this, but something else as well. Occupying the perspective of Napoleon. So in other words, imagining from the inside requires a first-person perception. Imagining from the outside does not. Eva Braun has argued for what she calls the tertiary imagination, what she describes as the, quote, capacity for momentary panoramas, for wide visions, unquote. That exists in people only potentially, because it can either be polluted within us or entirely starved out of us based on the stimuli and the experiences that we open ourselves up to. Braun says, quote, "It is involuntary insofar as its sights cannot, in their full enchantment, be summoned at will, though we can always provide ourselves with their pale replicas. It is voluntary insofar as we can make ourselves ready and receptive by seeking out certain sights and sounds and texts, and nurturing an aversion to others." Now that's Jim Fire Dandy and all, but it still doesn't answer the next vital question. What good is the imagination actually for? I think a lot of people, if asked this question, would say that, well, imagination is necessary because it's the power that allows you to improve your own life. If you can imagine it, you can do it. And all those other cliches. Want to be a billionaire, for example? Just imagine yourself as a billionaire and eventually you'll actually become one. Want to become the CEO of your own company? Just imagine yourself wearing a $10,000 suit, sitting in a suede chair in your own personal office on the 50th story of some glass monolith, surrounded by a personal army of secretaries, all of whom conveniently have signed non-disclosure agreements. Or as George Bernard Shaw put it slightly more poetically, imagination is the beginning of creation. You imagine what you desire, you will what you imagine, and at last you create what you will. The problem with this understanding is that it makes the imagination completely utilitarian. Truth, honor, justice, all the other virtues and noble sentiments have absolutely no role to play in this. Instead, the imagination becomes just the proverbial greasy, underhanded agent who gets for us whatever we want it to get for us. Right and wrong, truth and lies, good and evil have absolutely nothing to do within these parameters. No, instead, the actual reason for why the imagination is so necessary for our lives comes at the end of an essay that C.S. Lewis wrote in 1932, in which he wrote one of the most profound sentences in the 20th century. Reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of understanding. Contrary to the implication behind Ben Shapiro's mantra, facts don't care about your feelings, we are not just brains on a pair of stilts. We are brains, yes, but we are also hearts, souls, and passions. As such, chains of logical syllogisms actually don't do a lot leading us to the truth. They can help, but in reality, logic, rational argument, piles upon piles of facts do very little to actually convince us of the error of our ways. Our subjective experiences, our childhoods, our prejudices, our preconceptions of the world can all raise massive roadblocks against even an entire army of marshaled facts and arguments. Through the power of the imagination, however, truth, especially transcendental truth, can be much more easily accepted and digested, because now it's not simply our rationality that is engaged in finding the truth. It is our rationality, it is our head, but it is also our heart and our soul as well. The imagination wraps the entire person up in the pursuit of the truth. More often than not, the truth as it is woven through a story. And this point takes us to a guy by the name of John Rule Ronald Tolkien. Although he's best known as a fantasy writer today, especially for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was a genuine scholar. He was an Oxford Don who didn't just have a nice piece of cream-colored paper peppered with Latin phrases telling the world that he was smart or that he had actually was the possessor of said cream-colored paper. No, he was an authentic academic in the sense that he was spurred on by a genuine desire for the truth and knowledge, and then wanted to disseminate that knowledge to his pupils. And in 1938, in his capacity as Oxford Don, Tolkien gave an academic presentation entitled On Fairy Stories, in which he made the very bold and true claim that elements in fairy tales, the ogre's castle, the homely inn, for example, were much more real than things that we actually encountered in the real world itself. And the reason for this is because elements in fairy tales are actually the incarnations of actual transcendental realities. The ogre's castle, for example, is an incarnation of evil, of darkness, of disorder, whereas the hospitable inn, or as we might say, the last homely house in the West, is an incarnation of goodness, of order, of friendship. The factory that we work at, the lamppost on the corner, by contrast, they're real in the sense that they're there, but there's nothing really behind them. They're neither good nor evil. They're just blobs on the landscape. Now, the reason why things like the Ogre's Castle and the Last Homely House in the West are more real than things that we see in the real world is because they have been cooked in what Tolkien called the cauldron of a story. This is where things, no matter how distant, how old, or how forgotten, have been mythologized. And a wonderful example of this is King Arthur. It's a basic fact today, one that was even accepted in Tolkien's time, that King Arthur was actually a real flesh and blood man. It's just that there was no Camelot, there was no Excalibur, there was no Round Table, there was no quest for the Holy Grail, there was no Merlin. Basically, Arthur was real, but none of the things that made Arthur Arthur were real. He was just a Briton chieftain who fought to preserve his people after the Romans had left the British Isles. It wasn't until Arthur's bones were added to the cauldron of story that all of these elements, these magical, fantasy, imaginative elements, were actually added to him, which then, in consequence, made Arthur more real than he had ever been in real life, because it transformed him from being simply a petty ruler fighting invaders on some fog-enshrouded morning to the incarnation of order, chivalry, honor, and Christendom that he became in the French romances, and by which he is known throughout the world today. The imagination then is the power by which we can actually reach out and touch these transcendental truths which have been preserved in the cauldron of story. And because truth is universal, what is factually and or morally true in Arizona is factually and or morally true in Abuja, it means that everyone can recognize these truths in these stories, whether or not the people who wrote them or recorded them looked like us or not. And this is why men like Homer and Virgil and Shakespeare and Dickens and others have become global toasts, sometimes millennium after their deaths. It's because everyone recognizes the transcendental truths that they were conveying in their works. And when our imagination allows us to see and to touch the transcendental truths that are woven in myths and stories, then it actually does something else too, gang. It actually allows us to become more human. Remember Jacques Maritain? We've talked about him before, the 20th century French Thomist philosopher. One of his big ideas was that man was the only creature who actually had to fight for his essence. In other words, it wasn't that some people were less human than others as a matter of race or biology, but that human beings, when they actually aligned themselves to the true, the good, and the beautiful, actively added to their essence. They actually literally became more human. And this is exactly what our imaginations can do when we are allowed to actually commune with the cauldron of story. When we read Virgil's Aeneid, for example, we can imagine ourselves as Aeneas sailing from Troy to Rome in the ancient world. Sure, no problem. But we can also do something even more. We can hold up the model of Aeneas in our minds on a plinth, and we can draw strength and inspiration and courage from his example, especially when it pertains to doing our duty, even when we know that doing our duty is only going to cause us pain and suffering. Our imagination, in other words, doesn't just allow us to pretend to be Aeneas on his voyage. It allows us to be Aeneas in our own lives. This holds true for all the characters found in great literature and in mythology, from Robin Hood to Prospero to John Henry and Perseus. And what's more, it extends into real life. This is how we can aspire to be someone like George Washington, someone like Abraham Lincoln, even in a world that actively now spits on their names. These models of noble and heroic actions and virtues, their stories inflamed with transcendental truth that are ready to inspire and spark in us the fire of greatness, are stolen from us, to be replaced with absolute garbage. No, seriously, I mean that, gang. Take a listen to what students at the Loudoun County Public Schools in Virginia are now being required to read instead of Shakespeare and Homer.
Jasper wasn't even my boyfriend, just this dude I did some hacking with once in a while. He was pretty basic library systems, low security not in my league at all, but he had a big and sometimes a girl just needs a big.
Her top lip curled up. Wait a minute, is that what's really going on? She did your homework and you ate her. Is that why you're crying?
It's okay, it's cool. This is what girls do at parties. I told myself and kept dancing with the boy. I couldn't see the alcohol making my waist wind faster.
Truly the stuff that will spark the imagination of the young and spur them on to great deeds worthy of their fathers. The bannings, supposedly for diversity and inclusion, they're actually for dehumanization, so that in a perverted twist from Pygmalion, we won't become better, but we will actually become worse. And in so doing, we will reflect them. But as always, gang, what say you? Let me know your thoughts, ideas, and comments down in the comment box below.
So always look for the silver lining and try to find the sunny side of life.
And the silver lining for this week, gang, is Abel Gance's epic 5.5-hour silent film, Napoleon. Which is apropos because we just passed the 200th anniversary of Napoleon's death on St. Helena on May 5th. This movie is a visual feast for the eyes. I will admit that I am not the biggest fan of silent films. Love films, silent movies are a genre that I've never really have been able to get into, but this movie is a film like no other. You don't even really notice that it is a silent film, thanks to the wonderful epic score created for this restored version by Carl Davis. It tells the story of Napoleon from his school days at Brienne, France, to his first Italian campaign. This was actually supposed to be the first of 6 movies that Abel Gance was going to make that chronicled the entire life of Napoleon. Now, it's actually very historical, and at the same time, it is not very historical. They actually went to the places where Napoleon went. For example, they went to his home island of Corsica and shot actually around the house that he lived in as a boy. But that sort of historical accuracy, and also they pull a lot of the dialogue actually from history itself. You have that on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have blatant hagiography. You have the not so subtle assertion that Napoleon is in fact the eagle. He is a force of nature himself. There's even a scene where the ghosts of Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, who were three of the real leaders of the revolution and later the Reign of Terror, they come to Napoleon and basically say, hey, we screwed up. You have to now save the revolution from what we did. Will you do this? And Napoleon says, yes, I will. That probably never ever happened. But honestly, gang, it gets into what we've been talking about in this video. Mythology, story, the cauldron of story, and the imaginative power to inspire and spur people on to greatness. Now, this is a bit of a difficult movie to find. I mean, it's really not. You can find it on Amazon, but the DVD is a region 2 DVD. So unless you have a DVD player that plays all regions, you're going to be in a bit of a spot, but it is entirely worth it. I am going to play the trailer for you here so that you can see what I mean. Abel Gance's Napoleon. Silent, yes. Epic, yes. And a film's film. If you can, watch it, enjoy it. You will not forget it. Well, that about wraps up everything for this week, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, don't forget to leave a comment, smash that like button, and share it with your friends on social media. And if you like videos about culture, politics, and religion from a unique POV, then subscribe, ring that bell like Quasimodo so that you will never be left out when I post new videos just like this one on the channel. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed to my channel. I appreciate every single one of you. And until next week, gang, stay safe and stay free by daring to read, think, speak, and write. I'll talk to you soon. Ciao.
There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. Living there, you'll be free if you truly